Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with coverage of round 12 of Tata Steel 2021, the penultimate round. Let's look at the standings before the round. Anish Giri was leading the tournament with 7.5 points out of 11 games, followed by 3 players half a point behind, Caruana, Firouzja and Van Foreest. Half a point behind them, Yesipenko, Carlsen on +1, he's not going to win this tournament. Groundaly is on 50%, Hari Krishna and Tari on -1, Vachier-Lagrave and Duda on 4.5, Wojtaszek and Anton Guijarro on 4 points and Donchenko in bottom place. The pairings for round 12 were Vachier-Lagrave against Duda, Hari Krishna, Donchenko, Yesipenko, Van Foreest, Groundelius, Tari, Caruana, Anton Guijarro, Giri Firouzja and Wojtaszek against Carlsen. And in this video we're going to look at a very important game for the top position. Giri leading the tournament, Firouzja half a point behind. And here we see both players in the opening of their game. Let's get into the game. It's a very long game, so I will not go into too much detail on the opening. We have a French defense and f4, c5. Let's put the opening moves on the board. a3. More common is the line played in the game without the inclusion of a6 and a3. But even that is known and has been played before. C takes d4, knight takes d4 and bishop c5. As always in the French, black's problem piece is the bishop on c8. If he can bring that piece into the game, that will be a huge achievement for black. White is going to try and make it difficult for black to get that piece developed. Let's continue. Bishop takes e3 check, queen takes e3, bishop b7 and bishop d3. That is a real grandmaster move. Knight c3 was protected by the queen and now it is not protected anymore. And can it be taken? Well, not really, because if black takes the knight, he loses the queen. Queen takes c3 and then bishop takes h7 is check with a discovered attack on the black queen. King takes h7, queen takes c3, white is winning. Very nice move, bishop d3. White is also not worried about the d5, d4 push with a fork on 2 pieces and a checkmate threat on g2 at the same time. Giri had covered that one as well. Actually, we see that move. d4 was played by Firouzja, but then there is queen e4. Dealing with a checkmate threat and threatening checkmate himself. So Firouzja took the queen. The knight is still attacked, but now the knight recaptures on e4. Bishop d5. Black has solved the problem of his bishop, but at the cost of a weak pawn on d4. While white has a weakness on c2. Knight g5 was played by Giri with the idea knight f3 and then attack that pawn on d4. g6. There goes that knight to f3 and black had to take. Rook takes f3 and we are in an endgame. The bishop tends to be better than the knight with pawns on both sides. As the bishop is a long range piece, it can easier switch from one side of the board to the other. And that is one reason that white is a bit better in this position. b5 was played to blunt the bishop somewhat. Bishop e4, hitting the rook, rook a to d8, rook d3, knight b6, and you can play rook a d1 to put pressure on this pawn, but then there is knight c4, and that's attacking the a3 pawn. That knight is now suddenly very strong. Giri could have gone for that, he didn't. Instead of rook a d1 he played bishop b7, and now the pawn on a6 is lost. Knight a4 was played by Firouzja. Giri took the pawn and knight c3. Black has compensation for the pawn. The knight is very strong on c3, protecting b5 and covering the d1 square. White's extra pawn stands on a3, which is not a great asset for white, and black has the threat of knight e2 check, which is a fork and wins a pawn. You can play g3 to protect that f4 pawn, but then there is rook d7, and now the bishop is in trouble, is in danger of getting trapped. And that's why Giri in this position played bishop b7. Firouzja is going to win the pawn back. Knight e2 check with that fork. King f2, knight takes f4, and rook d2. The rook was hanging on d3, and Firouzja pushed the pawn. And if you try to win that pawn with rook a d1 and you think black cannot take because then the rook on d8 is hanging, well, black takes anyway. Yes, you can win a rook on d8, but there is c takes d1 queen, rook takes d1, and this position is roughly equal. It's still a variation that Geary could have gone for, but after d3 he decided on c3 and not on c4, which is the strongest move according to the computer. B takes c4, rook c1, rook d4 to protect the c-pawn, bishop a6, and it's all very complicated. But that move c4 is a real computer move. Also, the commentators in the live broadcast did not think of this move, but it is the best move according to the engine. The more human move was played by Geary, c3, knight e2, and king e3. And now the d and c pawns will get swapped after all. Another computer move instead of king e3 would have been a4. And after b takes a4, rook a3, protecting the c-pawn, which was attacked by the knight. And white's plan is to push those pawns. But king e3 was played. And those pawns were swapped. Knight takes c3 and rook takes d3. A pair of rooks was swapped. And knight a4. Let's continue. Rook c1, rook d8 check. King drop back to e2. King g7, bishop c6, attacking the b5 pawn, and Firouzja had to defend it, putting the rook in a passive position. Rook c2, restricting the knight on a4 as much as possible. White has the better position, he has the better minor piece, and pawn b5 is a real target. King f8 and king d2. White's idea is to bring the king all the way to b3, and then take with the bishop on b5. Then black will recapture, but then the king can take the knight, which is then unprotected, and that way white will have won a pawn. You can also play king d1 instead of king d2, but here the commentators in the live broadcast showed a nice combination. Knight b6, and then you can take that pawn on b5, which is unprotected, but then there is knight d5, threatening the bishop and also threatening knight e3 with a fork. And white can solve both those problems with rook c5, protecting the bishop and taking knight e3 out of the position. But then, do you see it? How can black win a piece? Yes, with rook takes b5, rook takes, knight c3 check is a fork after all, king c2 and knight takes b5. Better for black. This was not forced, but it is a nice variation. Let's go back to the game. We had played king d2 with that idea to bring the king to b3, planning to win the b5 pawn. King e7, king c1. Geary said after the game that he thought he was completely winning at this point. f6, e takes f6, king takes, the white king marches on to b3, king d4, and there is that king on b3. In the meantime, black has activated his king and created a passed pawn himself. King d3 was played here. Rook f2 to get the rook out of harm's way, and e5. If you now continue with your plan of bishop takes b5 check, rook takes b5 and king takes a4, then indeed white has won a pawn. You're attacking the rook, so rook b7, and white's plan has worked. He has won a pawn, but in the meantime black has centralized the king, has created a passed pawn. Yes, white has two passed pawns, but as the saying goes, one pawn runs faster than two pawns. Black is actually better in this position. So Geary decided not to go for that plan with bishop takes b5. He played rook f7, and Geary thought, as he said after the game, that this move was very precise, and the engine agrees, white has good winning chances. In fact, Geary said, I was completely in control of the position. I saw all the lines. Geary was very optimistic here. We have made the time control, we're on move 44, and knight b6 was black's move. That gives away that pawn, with check, king d4, and a4. White is a pawn up. Geary was critical of himself for this move, a3, a4. He said he should have kept the pawn on a3, because the queenside pawns are not really going to roll forward anytime soon, and on a3 the pawn protects the other pawn on b4. Yes, pawns don't move backwards, and Geary regretted to make that a4 move, which looks very logical. Pass pawns must be pushed. Knight d5 was played by Firouzja, and Geary said that he first thought he was completely winning, but that black was able to coordinate his pieces and that it was not easy to break this coordination. A very complex game. Can white not take on h7? Yes, he can, and he did. And now white is 2 pawns up. It's looking good. But black has this trump card, his own e-pawn. Rook f7, and the pawn gets 1 step closer to promotion. Geary has to hurry back to stop that pawn, and the knight jumps to c3. Rook f4 check, king e5, rook f3, and knight takes b5. And now Geary decided to sacrifice a piece, and he will get 4 pawns for it. He could of course have recaptured on b5, but then king d4 and the e-pawn is too strong. White is not going to win this game. So as said, Geary decided to sacrifice a piece, that bishop on b5. He took on e3 with check, king d4 attacks the rook, and rook g3 attacking black's last pawn. But it means that black can now save the knight. Knight d6, rook takes g6, and indeed we have this very complicated endgame where white has 4 pawns for the knight. Geary said, I was fine with the endgame of 4 pawns against the knight, which must be winning. Move 54, knight e4, a5, king d5, a6, knight c5 check. You cannot take, the pawn is pinned. King a3, knight d3 and a7. After the game, Geary said that maybe he should not have pushed the a-pawn so quickly. Rook has to go to a8 and rook g7. King c6, and now the pawns on the other side go forward. And here knight e5 with the idea of knight d7 to block the 7th rank so that the rook can then take on a7 was what Geary had expected. But Firouzja played knight f4 instead of knight e5, and Geary said after the game that he had missed this move. He said that here he should have played king a4, and he gave this variation: knight e6, b5 check, king b6, rook g6, threatening to win the knight. The knight is pinned. Rook takes a7 check, an in-between move, king b4, and then rook e7 to protect the knight. And Geary said, I saw this line but thought that it was not winning anymore. I was shocked. So Geary did not go for this line as he thought that this would not win. But after the game he seemed to have changed his mind and thought that this might have been his best chance. It's a very difficult endgame. After knight f4, instead of king a4 and the variation we just saw, Geary played g4. Looks logical as well. Knight e6, rook f7 and knight c7. A more clever way to block the 7th rank, said Geary. Apparently the knight is better on c7 than in a line we saw where it goes to d7. Geary kept pushing his pawns. And now the a-pawn goes off the board with check, king b2, rook back to a8, g6 and knight e6. One of black's ideas is to sacrifice the knight for the 2 white pawns on the king side. And then the rook endgame with the white b-pawn will be an easy draw. h5, rook h8 attacking the h-pawn. So rook h7 and rook g8, and here Geary offered a draw and Firouzja accepted the draw offer. White's winning chances have indeed evaporated. The game could have concluded with king c3 and then knight f4, king c4, and then black is going to sacrifice the knight. Knight takes h5, rook takes h5 and rook takes g6, and this is an easily drawn endgame. The b-pawn will not win the game for white. Easy draw. Big disappointment for Anish Geary, who could have won this game and then taken a full point lead into the last round. But as we'll see in a minute, Geary is still leading the tournament. Great fight back from Alireza Firouzja. It looked very dark for him this game, but he hung in there and got his draw in the end. And this is the moment that Geary offered a draw, making the international symbol of crossing the fingers, which means I'm offering a draw. The results of round 12, we saw 6 draws and a win for Hare Krishna, who beat bottom place Donchenko. So not a lot has changed in the standings. Geary is still leading by half a point over Caruana, Firouzja and Van Foreest. Everybody got half a point extra apart from Hare Krishna, who is now back on 50% with 6 points. Donchenko was in bottom place and is still there. Sunday the 31st of January will see the 13th and last round of the Tata Steel 2021 tournament. It will be very exciting. We'll see Carlsen against Vachela Graf, Firouzja with white against Wojtaszek. Firouzja has to win, you feel, to have a chance to win this tournament. Anton Guijarro is playing the tournament leader Anish Giri. Giri will be black. Will he go for a draw or will he try to win the tournament outright by winning the last game? It also depends, of course, what Anton Guijarro's intentions are. We'll see Tari against Caruana. Caruana also half a point behind the leader. We'll see Van Foreest with white against Brandelius. And Van Foreest can also still win this tournament. He is also half a point behind Giri at the moment. Donchenko, Yesipenko and Duda Hare Krishna. It's going to be very exciting and I will be here after the round to tell you what happens. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel and please leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you liked the video, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.